And afterwards, he didn't lecture me, and he was at super old school, like a line officer, not a supervisor, but just like old dog that was just like, "Hey, man." He just kind of looked at me, and I was like, and I was hat in hand, I was apologizing. He's like, "You don't need to apologize. I just need you to learn."
Whatever action they did has already happened, right? Whatever mistake did already happened. And so to jump on them and to be so hard on them and critical afterwards doesn't change what happened. And in many ways makes them defensive. And it's oftentimes how they'll remember you.
First responders know the struggle of keeping their gear fresh. Sweat, smoke, and other odors can cling to your equipment, and much of our stuff can't be thrown in the washer. Enter Arrest My Vest, an odor eliminating spray for vests, tactical gear, bunker gear, and more. Unlike other sprays that just mask odors, Arrest My Vest eliminates them at the source, leaving your gear fresh and odor free. It's non toxic, natural, and plant based. There are several scents, or if you're like me, you can opt for the fragrance free. Arrest My Vest is made in the USA and has been serving first responders across the nation with a money back guarantee. Find it at arrestmyvest.com or on Amazon. Hey, Grit Nation, I got a couple things I'm really excited to share with you. The first is that the newsletter, free newsletter, is now live. All you got to do is go to bluegritwellness.com to subscribe. It is basically a summary of everything good and gritty for the week, including some exclusive content specifically on the newsletter. That'll include wellness information, nutrition, things that you ask, Q&A, as well as updates about Blue Grit, offerings, news, things that'll help you out. Next order of business. For years, I've been asked what kind of nutritional supplements I use because I've been into learning about health, nutrition, fitness for so long. And for years, I landed on NutriCost. And it's only a recent thing that I've been an affiliate, but now I get to pass the savings on to you. So if you go to NutriCost.com, use code BLUEGRIT, that's just BLUEGRIT, you get 10% off. Literally just a couple items, you get free shipping. And the reason why I found it was because it was always the best quality for the best value. So I always recommend people look at the ingredient list, look out for things like sucralose. It has the lowest amount of unnatural ingredients if you're looking for that kind of thing, whether it's your whey protein isolate, which I toggle on and off of, or organic vegan protein to cut down on different chemicals that I just generally like to avoid. It's not just protein, it's creatine and minerals, vitamins, things like L-theanine and magnesium, which I use regularly to help my nervous system power down. It aids rest and recovery, promoting better sleep. So whatever it is, go to NutriCost.com and you can just enter the code BLUEGRIT to get your 10% off. Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, welcome back to Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric, and today I have returning guest and my buddy, Trevor Wolcott. Welcome to the show, man.
Yeah. Thanks for having me again. It's becoming a reoccurring thing.
Yeah, it couldn't have gone that bad, or like people would have rioted, the show would be over, we'd be banned, and the whole nine.
Yeah.
First episode, I actually looked this up. So early on in the heyday, and someone, another law enforcement officer from the East Coast reached out, and he's like, "Hey, man, I found your stuff, and I've been listening. Super cool." I'm like, "Oh yeah, what episode?" He's like, "I started at the beginning, episodes 1 and 2." And I was like, "No, don't do that. Like those are, because like the sound quality is terrible, and I'm super clunky, and it's really uncomfortable." I'm like, "I'd like to think that we've come a ways with just the flow and knowing how to edit, like some kind of, I guess, like passable, I suppose, editing abilities." But he's like, "No, I'm just gonna start here and start chipping away." I'm like, "Okay, well, jump ahead if you feel like it's not engaging you quite enough." But
Yeah. Can't you like go back, delete those ones, and then just renumber them? So then like your number 50th could be your first and it would sound great.
I could, but it's also like, if we don't learn from our history, how are we gonna progress?
There we go.
So I don't want to erase it. And there are really, really good conversations. And a lot of fantastic guests. I might have just been more uncomfortable with the whole interview process and just feeling things out.
Yeah, for sure.
But episode 17, that's with Trevor. And then, not super long ago, we had 155. That was the gritty panel, real talk, cops, police identity, attitude. That was with JT from Survive Policing and our friend Mac from the Zen Cop. So, yeah, how have you been since then, man?
Good. Just trucking along, doing my thing and just excited to be here again. It's been fun every time and I don't anticipate anything less this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in that private sector life.
Dude, living that corporate life.
Corporate.
Corporate.
You sold out.
I
Corporate.
did, man. I went from working for the man to working for the man, just a different one.
Yeah, you're in that ivory tower.
Yeah.
It's beige-ish. It's pretty ivory. It's pretty whitish. The building itself.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm not going down that rabbit hole.
No. All right. Well, today we've had a few ideas bounced around, and it was pretty cool because Trevor's a reader. He's someone that likes to develop himself. I have not always been a reader, but I'm getting better, and I do like to absorb a lot of information from different influences. I recently had somebody ask like what I'm reading, like what am I always reading, and I'm like, well, I really just try to absorb a lot of different stuff. I'm not like this deep dive into books like cover to cover kind of guy. I'm like, I pick up something, I usually read a chunk of it, I scan, and I'm usually like looking at a few books at a time. What about you? Do you go like cover to cover?
Yeah, I usually do. Or I'll get like three
Impressive.
quarters of the way and then fizzle out and never finish. I probably have 10 books where I just never finish the last paragraph. It's probably more about myself, like a
Yeah,
deep
what does
dive
that
weird
say about
thing.
you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Psychoanalyze you.
that's not where we're going right now.
That's not the
Um,
point.
but no, I'm a really big reader, and I think as I get older, even more so. And it used to be just reading for fun, like maybe some history books, but now it's more books that kind of challenge me or my perception on things or how I do things. And that's maybe not everyone's cup of tea, but I think reading is huge, even if it is just for pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where these days, no one really has any excuse because a lot of the high value content, you can get it in video form, right? You can get it, like, you can have some of these authors that are doing keynote speeches like for free on YouTube, right? And you can do audiobooks, you can do podcasts. And so there is generally a format that's good for somebody. But, the famous, maybe infamous for some, Bill Blowers said, and I don't think he invented this. He invented a lot of sayings, but not this one. Leaders are readers, right? And so it's the concept that you're always needing to learn and humble yourself as the student to continue to better yourself and have the best that you can put out.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And there's really nothing we're dealing with in life that hasn't been dealt with by someone else or
Hmm.
already been thought of or already been put on paper. And sometimes just holding that piece of paper and rereading it can kind of reframe it in your brain, not to deep dive too much. But I love that quote, leaders are readers. And I think Bill Blowers did create that. So we'll attribute that
I
to
feel
him.
like it's too PG, it's too G rated for a novel creation of Bill, a Billism.
Yeah, but I mean, not to go on the Blowers tangent, but anyone that knows him knows he's a true leader. And so if that's the key to it coming from him, then I think we should all take note.
Yeah, absolutely. Look up the episode. He came on the show early on as well. I don't have the episode number in front of me. Without further ado, we're talking about reading, development, self development, leadership. And the book that we're going to be talking about today is How to Win Friends and Influence People. And this might be a title or phrase that people have heard for a long time. I know I heard it ages ago. Dale Carnegie, right? And so it's this super, what did you say, like roughly 100 years old?
Yeah, I think he originally wrote it in like 1936. And
Mm-hmm.
it's obviously been updated with some more recent analogies, but a lot of it is not. A lot of the people in it you might not know, these kind of historical figures, but as you read it, you're like, all of this 100% still applies, and
Yeah.
probably will always apply because it's just about humans.
Yeah. And I was telling you when I first heard about the book and it was recommended, and it's recommended like on high from all different types of resources, speakers, celebrities, what have you, business owners, CEOs. But when I heard the title, I was like, man, that's not my thing. Cause like, how to win friends? Like, I was like, I have friends. I'm like a friendly guy. Right. And then influence people. And then that has such a oftentimes negative connotation to it. So I just kind of tabled it. I was not interested to ever really pick up the book, except for more recent years. I was like, there's got to be something to it. And you can learn a lot from something you don't agree with, or you don't agree with all of it. And so I actually did did the perusal of the book, and then you've been working on it too. You're most of the way through, so figured why not talk about that? Because even when you talk about friends and influencing people, that is so much of what police work is, and that's so much of what corporate life. That's just like life, right?
Yeah.
Personal and professional life, and like how are you interacting with people so that you can be effective in what it is you're trying to do?
Yeah, and I'm the same as you. I mean, every time I'm deep diving in this book right now, and I've been talking a lot about it with the people I work with and things like that, because there's just some really good points with it. Every time you say the title, you have to kind of preface it with like, I know it sounds bad, but it's really good. But
Hmm.
I mean, I think winning friends in this kind of just came to me in the moment is like a friendship is not something that you just get. You kind of have to earn and you have to work
Yeah,
at, and in a way, you do have to win it. You have to win it in the sense of proving yourself as a friend, and being there for them, and winning might not be the strongest term, but it implies some sense of work that you have to put into it. And so maybe not the
yeah.
best title, but I think there's a lot to it.
Yeah, yeah, and think about the times, and yeah, we do. That's kind of sad that we sometimes have a negative connotation with the word win, and
Hmm.
maybe it's just because, well, it's not all about winning and these things that you hear about as a kid. But no, we do support, and most of us, especially those listening in, like respect and appreciate like a competitive spirit. They appreciate like putting work into something. Like nothing is really that valuable if you didn't have to work for it. And so I think that that's a good flip, man. Is that just even I think you said it too, right? The notion of earning your friendships. I think
Yeah.
if it was titled like how to earn friendships, like that first part, people would be like, oh yeah, like friendships are earned. Like love, care, appreciation is for sure earned. Respect is earned, right? So, yeah, essentially the same thing as what this book is covering.
Yeah. 100% agree.
Yeah. So I did take some notes and then we'll get fired off here, but at the beginning, he actually just talks about some prolific criminals. You remember that when he's talking about murderers that get caught and then they're on the stand, or they go through like their kind of memoirs and stuff. And a lot of these folks are like, this sounds so bad. What their perception of themselves and what they believe in, they don't sound like bad people, right? And he talks about Al Capone, and it almost what I remember, it was a little bit ago, but it almost was like the sense like Al Capone saw himself as like a Robin Hood esque kind of hero, like a
Yeah.
or like an anti-hero, or kind of like a hero of the people, because he's abolished the system, and that's why he has organized crime. He's not doing all the tax stuff, right? So he's just doing his own thing and supporting like his like ground roots community, like where he came up, which was not a great place and time, or how he came up was not great, right?
Yeah, and I think there's even an example of a criminal in there who shoots a police officer for basically no reason
Mm,
and kills him, and then
hmm.
afterwards he basically writes that he would never hurt a soul. And I think it sets like this really good framework for the rest of the book, in the sense of that people's perception of themselves is not necessarily reality, or humans have an innate ability to justify their actions or to view themselves in a more positive light. And I think it's just a fascinating hook to get you thinking in a different way, that if these people that did these very horrific things can still think of themselves as good people, or not necessarily be totally cognizant of their actions and what they're actually like, that probably spans to all of us to some sense. I'm sure I have done some things that I didn't think were a big deal and probably hurt someone, and you don't recognize it and you don't view it because we view it in a very different lens. And so as I read it, it was those were big moments for me to realize that. But also, I think it's just a good setup for the kind of where the rest of the book goes.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really well said, because he yeah, he didn't have any sense that he was like a bad guy, and he like literally just, like he wouldn't hurt a soul. I remember that phrase, and you're like, you
Yeah,
literally just shot and killed a dude and a police officer, right? And so that hits home for many listeners, obviously. But I think that there's a flip that we can look at a couple different directions. One is that if we are going to contend with the criminal element, like we can't think. I suppose like what I'm trying to say is like hearing that account and looking at, kind of criminality and criminal minds, like this kind of like profiling without going down that rabbit hole. It's just recognizing that people are people. And as you said, like they're living their own perspective. And so if we are going to catch them, if we're going to think like them or try to get the edge on them or interrogate them, like it doesn't do any good to come from a place of judgment in the moment, right? I'm not saying like agree with what they're doing. I'm saying we've heard, you and I both, like so many people that we know and have worked with that would get these, I suppose, like put on these clinics of like interrogation, but it's because in the moment they could level or appear to level with the person, and then that suspect would actually think that they're their buddy, and they actually understand and they're empathetic to like what they're going through and why they did what they did, which is really like, I mean, that's such an art, skill, talent for people to work through. That's super impressive, but ultimately it does come back to what we're talking about, right? In that moment, the interrogator, the detective, is trying to appear like a friend, and he's influencing or she's influencing this, sometimes someone that made a mistake and sometimes like an absolute like piece of work, right? An absolute scumbag who did this thing. And that's our job as officers, is to try to get that justice and find the best version of the truth we can to present to judge and jury.
Yeah, and those people that we're talking to, that might be genuinely how they feel, like their
Hmm.
moral compass is on a different path, and yeah, you got to kind of play that game. But that can obviously spawn to much less serious things, like maybe if your significant other does something a certain way. It's just understanding that people are going to view things differently than you, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense to you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we can even say that about ourselves, right? Like, look at our younger selves, and no examples, please. But like, I've shared with a lot of buddies. I was like, man, like, I think back in college, and even my wife, like, I was like, think about in college and like how my brain appeared to be wired, like what my priorities were, and how I was utilizing my time and things like that. And I felt kind of guilty about some of the things, and how I talked to people and how I even like talked with my friends. Like, we were wildly inappropriate. Um, and yeah, I don't like keep on the straight and narrow with regard to humor with my friends now, but it was like really like I'd feel very uncomfortable talking about how the type of jokes that we'd make to each other, but it's also kind of like what you did, right? So it's not to make an excuse, and I don't want anyone to draw any crazy parallels like, oh, like that's how things were. But it's like, okay, how can you learn from that? And that's a common thing for police applicants listening in. It's like the flip is, how can you learn from that? What have you instilled that helps you recognize a better way for you in the course of your life now? And then also, like, let's not just dwell and judge and shame ourselves, because that's just, it becomes such a waste of angst and effort.
Yep, agreed.
All right, so back to the book, going down the rabbit hole. But another early example, he talks about Mark Twain. Like, they found these letters where he wrote these like pages of this angry rant to somebody, and it made me think about like the angry email or like the angry text message or even the angry phone call or the angry post, right? And how so many famous folks had to like walk it back, and so many not famous folks get in trouble at work or whatever for firing off that heated email. And then we hear this, hey, like, don't send the email, that kind of little tip, right? Like, type
Yeah,
it, like, close it out, find it in the drafts and delete it, like that whole thing. But I was thinking about like Mark Twain, like how hot headed he must be to like literally sit down and write this thing, because it's not just like firing an email for like 30 seconds. Like,
yeah,
you had to write this thing for however long, you had to handwrite it, and then you had to put it in an envelope, and then you had to seal it, and then you had to take it to the post office, and then you're like, yeah, I'm good, they got to know, right? And then you drop it off. So only just bringing that up because it's just a recognition that this stuff's been around forever. Like, emotions are hot, and if we want to communicate well with people, we have to recognize like we can't be rational when we're emotional. It's like that seesaw.
yeah. And I think that was in the kind of the category where he's talking about not criticizing people, which is an interesting topic because as an administrator yourself and as a current manager myself, there are times where there's discipline that needs to be done, but I think criticizing is a different thing. And I think he even gives an example where Abraham Lincoln was very critical of people, and then someone essentially challenged him to do a duel, if I'm not mixing up the stories, and he realized like, oh crap, that could have been the end of me. And he took a very different approach, and he would write letters and then never send them. That was kind of his avenue to get that out. But the whole premise was not criticizing people. And one of the points that he made that really stuck with me was whatever action they did has already happened, right? Whatever mistake they did already happened. And so to jump on them and to be so hard on them and critical afterwards doesn't change what happened. And in many ways makes them defensive. And it's oftentimes how they'll remember you is by being so hard on them. And so there's not necessarily a perfect answer for that, but I think we need to be really delicate in how we address issues with people where they make a mistake. I mean, you're in this role all the time where you're at. I mean, you get to review these things sitting at a desk, not out on the street. And I'm sure you're constantly having to check yourself and remind yourself, like, hey, this incident already happened. I wasn't there. I need to be empathetic. And what real benefit does it have to criticize this individual and find a productive way? So I'm glad you brought up that Twain thing, because that was the whole premise of that thing, was just how to appropriately deal with people and not criticize them. And you have to constantly kind of check yourself on that. And I find myself having to stop myself as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we all, those that are high drive and those listening that are into like self development, you're often times so hard on yourselves, and I'm so hard on myself, and that's where it comes from, right? So it's almost like I'm seeing like an officer do something. I'm like, man, young Eric, like don't do that, and like I did that kind of thing, right? So I'm trying to course correct the things that did as mistakes, or try to course correct in that fashion. Like, hey, how can we help this? So yes, it's not to say don't address issues, don't hold account, but criticizing is like that next level. So I think that it's like, okay, doesn't anyone want to be picked apart? No, like no one wants to be. It makes you feel like a child, and it takes you back to maybe when a teacher or a parent or a guardian figure would just be like nitpicking, and you're like, oh my god, get over, like, save me the lecture. I've know the lesson here. So I think that that's a valuable thing to remember. And I want to always connect back. Like there's so many episodes and themes that cover leadership, whether that's the main focus or not. But officers, people out in the community, like you are leaders in your own right, whether or not you're a boss or a manager, whether or not you actually have anyone under your supervision. Like you are a leader when you're going into that domestic, when there's a dispute and it's utter chaos and you're going there and you're settling things down. And then, because I've been there, is it helpful to tell people how poorly they did and how they made so many bad decisions and what got them to this point? And to throw back to another older episode with Chris Nielsen, retired Renton Sergeant, he's like, people don't need to know from you where they messed up.
Yeah.
They don't need you to tell them. They're very well aware that life's not going great. Like,
Yeah.
the police are in their living room. Like when you put it that way, you're like, yeah, for sure. And so they don't need somebody with a badge and like, with their arms crossed, like talking down to them. Like, just tell us where we're at. Tell us what needs to happen. And if there is an opportunity for that empathetic listening and conversation, actually, then maybe someone wants some advice, right? We've all been on those calls where someone is actually open to advice and feedback. And those are obviously way more productive conversations than the one-sided, like, just take me to jail. Stop talking. Because
Yeah.
I've had that told to me because I was just I had to say my piece, right?
Well, to piggyback on that, and a great example, I mean, it's funny you brought up Bill Blowers in this, and this, I think this speaks perfectly to what we're talking about, criticism versus empathy and things like that. I will never forget, relatively early on in my career, maybe my second or third year, and I don't remember, I had an AD at the range. And oftentimes not the biggest deal. It can be, obviously, if someone hurts, but you're brand new and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm about to get hammered. And I believe Blowers was in charge of the range that time, and I had very few interactions with him, maybe one conversation. And after my AD, he sent this really long, really nice email, basically, and I hope he doesn't care that I share this. I doubt he would. He basically shared times where he had done that same thing. And it was this very empathetic email that he did not need to send by any means, where he related to it. He's like, you're probably going to be feeling X, Y, and Z. And then he put in there, hey, just corrective action, just do these things, break down your handgun 100 times or whatever it was. But I look back on that now over a decade later, and I vividly remember that email like it was yesterday. And the amount of respect I earned for him at that point is still stuck with me to this day, like this one interaction. And so the flip side can be true. If he would have been critical and a huge jerk to me, that's probably all I would remember from him 10 years later. But here I am. He had one moment of empathy in an email that he might have shot off in 5 minutes and didn't think anything of it, but he took the time to do it. And it's had a lasting impact. And it's been huge for me ever since to try to do that. And remember, sometimes all it is one interaction is all someone will ever remember from you and will be your legacy, essentially. So I'm glad you brought Blowers up, because that reminded me of that. And it's crazy to think one stupid email has such a big impact, but it's so true.
Yeah, that's huge. And it goes back and I don't know if I knew that you had one, but yeah, you don't need to tell any cop to like how how much shame and embarrassment you
Oh,
feel,
yeah.
and then you're like, and then from academy, I remember feeling guilty when I left rounds in my pocket in academy, like after range that you're supposed to check all your pockets, and then if you're not accountable for every round, then what does that say about you? Like your attention to detail. Now, did you bring a round home? Do you have kids at home? And then all these things, and just it's an important, I suppose, value to teach people to be very mindful of that. But I remember feeling like super guilty that I did, it was belabored. Like you got to check all your pockets, triple check all
Yeah.
this stuff,
Yeah.
all that. Yeah, I've certainly made a ton of mistakes, and I'll even say one right now, just to because that's kind of the point of this show, and a lot of leaders that come on. I feel like that's a huge piece of that. The other flip on the empathy is like to share vulnerability and mistakes for those following in your lead, right? So when I have the opportunity and it actually is aligned, I try to tell guys, sergeants, and officers like, "Hey, I'm not just like saying this just cuz like I did that same thing, or I really grappled with that. That was really hard for me as a new sergeant." But as a street cop, like I remember dealing with a group of juveniles, and I don't remember if it was a robbery or what type of higher incident call, but you're doing the frisks, they're cuffed, and then you put them in the separate cars to try to figure out what happened. And a senior officer pulled a guy out of a car that I had frisked, and he found a full-sized, thank goodness, airsoft, but it doesn't matter. The point is, if he had a full-size airsoft in his sock, it could have been a full-size anything. And
Yeah.
so mentally, I was like, it's not any better that it's an airsoft. So all he did was he looked at me, and he took it out and set it on the Crown Vic, right, the trunk of the Crown Vic, and my heart sank. I just felt like I was like 2 inches tall, and I was just crushed, right?
Yeah.
And afterwards, he didn't lecture me, and he was at super old school, like a line officer, not a supervisor, but just like old dog that was just like, "Hey, man." He just kind of looked at me, and I was like, and I was hat in hand, I was apologizing. He's like, "You don't need to apologize. I just need you to learn, this." And I was like, I get it. And I'm sure he could see it on my face that I was just like so guilty. But again, yeah, that whole not to criticize, like the lesson was learned. He knew it, right? He could have said, and he could have blasted me. He could have blasted me in front of the whole crew, right? He could have brought it up a
Oh,
briefing.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, but he didn't. And so, yeah, much respect for handling it that way. He would have been entitled to. He would have been entitled to be super pissed,
Yeah.
knowing that, that kid could have accessed a real thing that could have hurt him, us, all of us. So yeah,
But really,
great
who does
point.
that benefit if he did yell at you? You know what I mean? You would have been embarrassed, and your memory, you wouldn't be sharing this story in this way now. You would have said, "Yeah, I earned it," but like it wouldn't be viewed in this positive light where you're like, "I actually respect him." Where he shot me a look, and he knew that that was
Mhm.
all I was needed. And so, if people like that can do it, or someone like Blowers, who's arguably probably one of the most badass people we know, can put himself in a 2-year cop's shoes and humbly admit that, I mean, that's true respect. And so, I love that you share that story, and I think we should all be more open to that. And it's easy to criticize newer, younger cops, um, and it's way harder, but way better to admit, "I've been there. I made that mistake. I've done that. I've had egg on my face. You'll be all right."
Yeah. Not to, I mean, we are staying on this point for quite a bit, but I
It's
think
a
a
good
flip on
point.
police culture, though, like, yeah, I absolutely agree with everything you said, and I'm gonna double down on that because we were officers with a couple years on, right? Like I might have been like a year and a half, 2 years, and I think you said like three for you, and that large mistake, right? It's not
Mhm.
nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, an 80 is a
There's a
big deal.
huge safety element in both of them, and officer
Yep.
safety is paramount above every other thing you can mess up in the culture. And so if a brand new guy or gal did what we did, like brand new, we had a couple years on, so we have like kind of less excuses. What I'm getting at, like how many people, and I want to say like department, big and small, East Coast, West Coast, would be like fire that person. Like,
Yeah.
do you think that would be a common response amongst the line, like talking crap and being like, "Did you just hear what that what that boot did? Like,
Yeah.
they could have drilled me in the back." And you're not in the same room, but like, "Yeah, coulda," but
Yeah, because I think that you haven't earned up that level of, like, respect. Now, not that we had a ton at 1 or 2, but you have more at 1 or 2 than you have brand new, and I think you're
mhm,
right. The knee-jerk reaction is to be angry and to dismiss them as a person and their competence level for a single mistake. That's the human nature. And so, yeah, it's interesting you bring it up. It could have been very much different, but I think that we could constantly strive to give that someone a pass now and then let them see if they make those mistakes repeatedly, then that's a different conversation. But
yeah. There's a point where I made a note, and it was, offering sympathy, and so maybe that's the tie-in here. in helping people save face, because I do venture to guess that a lot of healthier cultures would handle things the way they did with us, right? But with a brand new person, it's hard to imagine. I know a lot of cops from a lot of departments. It's like it's hard to imagine a culture that would be so forgiving quickly. And sure, there's reasons why not, right? They don't have the credibility. They haven't, at our station, like we had an opportunity to prove, I suppose, our worth. Whereas early on, they're trying to. You don't really know like what investment level you have, like what do they know, but I think that we just need to be recognizing that they have probably the biggest excuse to have the biggest mistakes because they have literally little to no time.
Yeah.
And so the expectation should be much lower. And just how do we handle that, right? Because coming out of the heels of the worst attrition and lowest staffing, and a lot of people and agencies are still there, is like, are we actually being sympathetic and understanding, empathetic, and training to that level rather than being like, hey, we need you up here at a 10, you're at a 2. You're done, versus like, okay, can we get to a 3 by the end of the week and then a 4 next week? And then we might be able to actually make it there, right?
Yeah, and not to keep beating this one, but I think it's an interesting point that just came into my head. I was thinking oftentimes we wouldn't even know to act that way or to have that level of empathy in that situation unless we've been through it where someone shared that with us. And so like I have this great example from Bill that is kind of a guiding force to where if I ever have someone that I supervise make that mistake, because I remember how much that meant to me. So it's kind of one of those things that maybe if a culture or an agency doesn't have that, that no one knows what that feels like to do that, and so that it never gets done. And so I think it's important for people um, to kind of pay it forward in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. The next point I had was to consider motivators. So when we're interacting people, again, it's empathy. Like try to imagine yourself in their space and place to some degree, like motivators. So like what are they trying to get at or get to? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like anything else. You can order someone to do something, and depending on your position, they may do it strictly because they were ordered to do so. But the best thing you can do is get them to do it because they want to do it. And so then I think it's important to understand that. And there is a really, I don't remember if this or I don't know if this is the best time to bring it in, but something that really stuck with me when I was reading this book is basically this quote in here. And I'm going to read it, so bear with me. It's just relatively short. It says, "Remember that people you are talking to are 100 times more interested in themselves and their wants and problems than they are in you and your problems. A person's toothache means more to that person than a famine in China, which kills 1 million people. A boil on one's neck interests one's more than 40 earthquakes in Africa. Think of that the next time you start a conversation." Now, obviously, that's a huge example, and not everyone views that. But I do think, to a certain extent, everyone's interests are always going to be the most important thing to them. And so when we're looking at motivators, we need to find what interests them, and that will always be more important than any motivator or any interest you have.
Yeah. I made the same note, and what I wrote down in my notes was a flip on 21st century policing training that talks about being interested versus interesting, right?
Hmm.
So it's like when you're meeting people or just touching base, like a lot of us like talking about ourselves. I get in this habit of just like rambling on this thing called a podcast, right? But ultimately people want to be they want to they want to feel valued, right? And
Yep.
you
Oh,
can't do
100%.
that if you're just talking about yourself and like what you care about. And I like how you started the flip of considering what they want is how you can lead people effectively, right? And so the converse is coercion, management, like totalitarian, like dictatorship. Like, yeah, I tell you to do this thing, and yeah, we have a rank and file, we have a uniformed paramilitary organization, so there is that command structure where if I tell someone to do something, they ought to do it. At the same time, so much better to ask and explain a little bit of the why that may be aligned with what they actually care about, right? Like they care about how the community views us, right? They care about like being legitimate in their job and being useful. And then I flip it like, hey, the reason why I'm asking you to do this patrol is like this business is absolutely suffering. Like they're getting handled through all these burglaries. If you could just hang out there in your, discretionary time, like it makes them feel way better. Also, they have cameras and they're going to see that and they're going to feel that we care because they're begging us to help with something. And even if you sit there and, you know, shoot the breeze with a buddy and type a quick report, like it goes a long way. But someone on the other hand is going to be like, "Oh, okay, it's not just like arbitrary because I get all these emails, I have all these requests, like there's a person on the other side of that." So you're asking for some empathy that they're now kind of taken on for that business owner, right? That person that's just like trying to make it men's meet and not be victimized every other week.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect point. I mean, everyone wants to feel valued and have a sense of purpose, and I even think that if they have those things, you actually have to ask them to do less things because they're just already doing many of those things. They're already a high performer at work. They're already doing those extra patrols oftentimes because they have a sense of purpose and value. So then you are just asking them to do less because they want to do it and they're already doing it.
Yeah. I want to cut back to what you just said, which was that, and you said it at the beginning of the last statement, which was you want people to do things because they want to do them, not just because they have to, like because you told them. And I'll leave this super vague, but there was another supervisor that's like, we should just like make it mandatory. Like we should make this like police action or this like kind of this task mandatory, and it will be better. Like they'll once they're doing it, they'll feel like they'll see the value of it. It might sound weird when it's so vague, but the thing is like that's literally the opposite of leadership. That's just compulsion. Like you're being coerced. Like you have to do this thing, and then there could be resentment. There could be all this stuff. Whereas it's just the notion of leading a horse to water, right? And um, that's getting them and helping them understand how water is very helpful for them, and it's going to help them feel better. It's going to help them do all the things that they want to do better. That might not be the way everywhere, but I think that's the gold or platinum standard that we should be going to for prospective and aspiring leaders.
Yeah, and there might be times where, I mean, that old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force them to drink. There will be people that will, no matter how much you present how good it is for them, they won't do it. And that's the world we're in. But I think it's important that that doesn't change how we view the world and how we continue to try to do it for the masses, right? It's like anything else. You don't want to punish the group for the actions of one. So as long as you have a good principle and you will always pursue that, you just have to understand that there's not everyone's going to get on board. These philosophical conversations, they feel good. We sit here, we talk about them, we go, yeah, 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 that sounds awesome. The real world's not that pretty, but I think if we always have these in our background and it's something we strive for, we'll always be better off.
Yeah. Yeah, the tenets and the concepts of leadership are never that crazy. It's the application that's really difficult, like extremely difficult because we're all people and we all have our own competing things. We have our own competing stressors, our personalities, our motivators, right? The thing we were just talking about. And so that's where there is so much value, I believe, in looking across disciplines and industries like military. Cool. I was never in the military, but I can learn a ton from military leadership concepts and examples. A CEO, right? There's a ton I can learn from that because they're just in it, kind of on their own. They got to figure things out and they got to move quick or they're gonna sink. So a lot we can learn from that. I suppose like I'm just gonna do the quick transition to the next chunk of notes I had, which was essentially like showing you care. So it's like caring about others. He talks about smiling. So
Hmm.
that's an interesting one, right? Like make people feel important. Use names. Give recognition, even if it's small. And so we are now. This could be a very predominant motivator for a lot of people, but again, I think it's making people feel valued, right? Making people feel seen and forming this like pleasant interaction, right? Like you're using someone's name, you're making contact, you're smiling, you're saying something nice. Like it sounds kind of it sounds extremely too basic, right? But this section that he definitely expands on for quite a while.
Oh yeah, and it's kind of a theme throughout, and it sounds basic, but I would challenge you to cognitively think about it throughout your day, and it's not basic. Like I've challenged myself to be better with names because I'm terrible. Oftentimes I'll shake someone's hand, and the second I let go of their hand, I've already forgotten their name. And that's been my whole life. And I've challenged myself to force a smile at people, even at work. I'm walking around this corporate giant place and I see people and I smile and they will always smile back. It's like they don't have a choice.
Always?
Most of the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes they
It's weird
don't.
when
And
they
then
don't
then
though,
I'm
right?
then it's weird. When they
Yeah,
don't
it's
smile
weird.
back, then it's weird. But I mean, these are very basic things, but if you are always thinking about them, you realize there's a lot of times we don't follow them. And they're these and you have to be intentional with them. Like I'm trying to be very intentional with saying someone's name every time I see them. Not every time, but most of the time because I do believe it's powerful. And there's a guy at work who does it every time he sees me. He will always say my name. And every time I'm like kind of impressed by it. And so there's that effect that we have of like you have to be intentional about these things and force yourself to do them, even though they sound so simple.
Yeah, that's such a good that's such a good example because I can very much be the same way, and I think for most people that are probably nodding to themselves, like, yeah, I forget names instantly. It's not that you're a bad person. You probably have a lot of things on your mind in that moment, and then you're like, am I going to meet this person again? Or no, we're sitting down at a table, and now I literally don't know their name. I just got it. I think that the intention is key in whatever it is we're trying to do or get better at. For me, and it's helpful to see what I'm like on, let's say, like a video, like a podcast, because I kind of lean towards having like this deadpan like expression if I'm just neutral, or like RBF if you want to call it, like resting bro
Yeah, that's
face.
what I was gonna call it, RBF, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And
I've seen
so
you with that.
yeah, so there's the awareness, but it's also like a recognition. Like awareness doesn't do you any good until you actually put something behind it. And inflection, like that's something that this project has really helped with as far as like public speaking, because I have no problem getting up public speaking, but I can realize how after hearing a recording, like I might get really impassioned and it might be good to sound really impassioned, but I can also get really serious and kind of start getting like a little monotone and not inflecting different ways, which why do I want to change for them? It's like, well, because I want to convey ideas and I want people to be at a point where they receive them. So that's like the give and take. That's kind of going back to what the whole concept of this book is. And, we talk about police testing a lot, whether it's entry level or promoting. And a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to try to be something I'm not. I don't want to be disingenuous. I want to just show up as I am. I'm like, well, showing me as you are might not be very like compelling. There's
Yeah.
some people that are naturally very charismatic. I think you're one of them. But there's other people that it's not like you're changing, but it's how you're enhancing the best parts of you so that you can show up better for someone. You can be better received by somebody else or a total stranger. And some people have that and some people need to work at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly like if their argument is, "Well, I don't wanna be someone I'm not." Well, it's like, what, you don't wanna be a better version of
You don't
yourself?
want to improve? Yeah.
You don't wanna improve? Yeah,
Mhm.
that's all that it is. I mean, it's like learning a new skill, learning a new trade, going to school.
Working
It's
out.
working out,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mhm.
It's all of those things. Yeah, you'll bust your butt in the gym because you want bigger muscles to look good, but you won't work on smiling at people or working on remember names. Like, he has a great example of a gentleman who would remember everyone's name. He would literally write it down on like a piece of paper afterwards and say it like 10 times and then tear it up. It might be hard for you, but you're gonna develop that skill. And so, yeah, you should always be wanting to improve yourself. And when you get to the point where you think, I don't want to do that anymore or I'm good enough, I think you should be looking in the mirror a little bit more because all of us could always be better. Be happy with who you are, um, but also be happy with challenging and pushing yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the word or the concept that comes to mind is ego. And we all know when we say ego, we think about the really like loud, brash, like I'm my way or the highway. And I just want to suggest people think about ego in the other sense of like it's your sense of self and how if you have an ego or you have work to be done with your ego, it's that you feel like you are unwavering, unchangeable, right? So going back to the example, if you say like I'm just bad at names and you say that and like that's how it is, like I'm just not going to get better at names. Like, hey, it's not that I don't care about you. I just I just don't care about you enough or anyone else I meet for the rest of my life to try to learn names better or
Yeah,
make some
yeah,
silly phonetic thing, right? Like same as like I've had this flip where like I've said for years like I'm bad at math. Well, I wasn't bad at math. I was actually great at math through like my whole adolescence. I was taking calculus as like a junior in high school, right? And I retook it because I stopped applying myself in it. We give ourselves these narratives. Shoot, you and I talked about like the off-duty consideration, like cops cops are just doomed. Like we just have bad relationships. We're prone to divorce, and that maybe we have a lot of challenges that make divorce historically or traditionally a likely outcome. But we can't keep saying, yeah, like cop marriages are so hard, and like that's probably why mine is going this direction. Like, okay, you are aware of it now. You have all the power to start working on it.
yeah. I love that. I love that whole spiel you just went on more than anything because I think we always do that sometimes without even thinking about it. I'm a big finance nerd and listen to all these finance podcasts and all. And everyone will always get in there. I'm just bad at finances.
Mm,
I'm just bad at
bad
finances.
with
And it's
money, yeah.
like, well, you're only bad at them because you just say I'm bad at them and you never try to get better. So, like, yes, you'll be bad at anything if you never do it. I'm bad at speaking Spanish because I don't ever try to speak Spanish. Like, it's the same with anything. And so that's the ultimate challenge is when you say, "I'm just not good at remembering names," the ultimate challenge is then say, "Okay, I'm gonna get better, and here's how I'm gonna do it, and I'm gonna push myself." It sounds so lame, but it's true.
Mm, it's fair, Dad. That means it's true. Now you know. So you're working on your Spanish,
There
man.
we go. Thank you.
I'm gonna get some like comment like, dude, that was terrible
That was terrible. Yeah, say that one more
pronunciation.
time just so
Yeah,
we can all hear.
es verdad.
There we go.
Man. Okay, cruising along. So this is a couple prongs in the same theme, but avoid arguments, reconcile egos. Oh, so we talked about ego just now. When you're wrong, admit it, and then this kind of circling idea that arguing doesn't win. And I'll say it again: arguing doesn't win. And I think that that's really relevant in this quote unquote really alpha culture of police. But I always also like to follow it up with like, there's not that many alphas in police, just like everywhere. And like, I'm not one of them. If you couldn't tell by now, I'm not this alpha personality. Most cops aren't. Most people aren't. But in an organization, for sure, you have any organization, you have some, and the rest of them are kind of like, yeah, I'm like trying to just get along with everybody and like build some cohesive harmony. What are your thoughts on that section?
I totally agree with it. And I also love that your comment on like alpha, because I think sometimes we always say like cops are alpha or I'm
Alpha
alpha.
AF, yeah.
But then when you really think about it, it's like we don't really work in the most alpha job in many ways. We're told what laws we can and cannot enforce. We're told how to enforce them. Everything we do is like a template almost like here's how you do handcuffing. Here's how you do this. Here's the marching orders from the bosses. Like we love this sense of structure and almost being told what to do. And oftentimes when we don't have that or there's confusion is when we feel the most uncomfortable. So in many ways, we're not alphas. In many ways, we're followers. We like rules. We like structures. So
Hmm.
it's kind of like we could, I mean, I feel like we could deep dive on that totally on a whole nother level. But yeah, I mean, talking things out is great all day. But I think the term arguing or getting into something like that is never going to benefit really anyone. I mean, we see it all the time in the world today. I mean, you even touch the world of politics, and it might as well be pointless to even say anything
Hmm.
because everyone's wherever they're at. And I think that's a big example of I don't know. I don't even know if I want to go. I'm not
Yeah,
going
no,
down there.
I'll just cut in and say yes, it's so prevalent. Like just think about social media, and some forums are more guilty for this than others, but like Facebook or Twitter/X, like right, like once there's a post and you see these people kind of like your fringe contacts, maybe they're friends of friends, and they're just like duking it out on your friends like post. Like I think it's one thing if people really, and that is the problem. I think that most people that engage in debate kind of think that they're going to change somebody's mind,
Hmm.
but if they were any good at pattern recognition, they would realize like that's not how minds are changed. Like
Hmm.
it's not words, deeds, it's experience, it's all these things. It's insight that takes a lot of time and some different level of awareness and maybe a conscious effort towards that awareness, or something happens to someone close to them where they are offered a different insight, right? But like just the whole like arguing to argue, and I do think that some people, and I'm sure this has been studied, but the debate, like beyond debate, it's like arguing just for the sake of arguing. They probably get some sort of like dopamine release from that, like conflict. Like there's probably a lot of people that actually kind of get high. I'll use that word on like arguing and conflict and just dissension.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, even this is kind of a prime example. I mean, one of your posts recently about some things with the January 6th stuff and those people being released is should not be a hot topic. Like it shouldn't be this political topic. It should be like, hey, these people violated the law and several of them hurt officers, potentially could have killed officers. And I don't agree, especially coming from the law enforcement background. It's very difficult for me to understand how anyone in this world could support some of those pardons. Now, the problem is it turns political when I don't think it should. And
Yeah.
it's like what you said. There's a lot of arguments that are going to come from that. And I was honestly a little bit surprised that you posted something like that because typically that's touching a world you don't really touch. But at the same time, I'm glad because at least for me, there's a visceral emotional reaction to those things, to those pardoning. And I think that's why you're putting it out there. And it's a difficult thing to digest, but it's messy, man. The whole thing is so messy.
Yeah, yeah, no, I appreciate that because to catch people up, there was blanket pardons for anyone involved in the January 6th at the Capitol, and there were officers, obviously injured, and people arrested for a horde of crimes, like including felonious assault. And so, not to get in the weeds because that really wasn't the point of the post, but every news outlet was talking about it, and a lot of police news was talking about it, and so I make a point, I suppose, sometimes outwardly and sometimes like just thematically. The things I talk about are things that affect officers, right? So Blue Grit being about building better cops, better agencies, better communities, is like being mindful like to these things that affect more of like how we do the job, and also like our psyche and our wellness, right? Like it's in the name, Blue Grit Wellness. And so I posted it, and I thought it was pretty, nonpartisan post. Like I'm like,
Yeah.
hey, I say nothing about the administration or pointing fingers. I'm intentionally. There's plenty of that. You can find it. But for me, I was like, man, I feel for the officers, because I can only try to imagine. Like, I kind of, in follow up response on someone else's podcast, Welcome to the Street podcast, like I talk about how I, along with you, right, were part of riotous situations in Seattle, to include after George Floyd's death. And so I know like that CDU, that civil disturbance riot situation, is extremely tense. And I remember watching the videos of the Capitol, and there's that one video, like it's basically, it sounds like a cop's being crushed by
Yeah.
the mob. And I'm
Yeah.
like, that is terrifying. They're not in riot gear. They're not on the line. They're like, which we were. We had protective mechanisms and gas if we needed it, all that stuff.
And still we saw some of our guys get hurt. I
Yeah, we
mean,
saw
yeah.
a dude got hit by a rock. One guy like had to kind of scrap with somebody, like knocked his mask off, and he's choking on, just sucking in all this like gas, and on and on. But my point being, like, I feel for the officers. This is a hard one, right? How many comments publicly about like, man, like it was kind of it's kind of surprising, but then it's not, talking about that polarization. But it's like, well, under the Biden administration, this and that. And I was like, okay. And then it's like, well, what about Seattle and Portland? I'm like, okay, yeah. Like I wasn't saying anything about them. Of
Yeah.
course I feel for the Seattle and Portland officers, like being up in this region. So really grasping at all these things just to argue. I even had somebody that was considering like having me as like a partnership, like affiliate. And they're like, whoa, like this is super political. Like, I don't know if we can bring you on if you're talking about administration. I was like, well, one, I'm not, but that's totally fine.
Yeah.
And they asked if I wanted to take it down. I'm like, no, I don't. Like, I'm not really in the business of like taking down something that is focusing on officer wellness and focusing on their mental health, and
Yeah.
just saying that this is a hard thing.
Yeah.
A lot of messages in support of what I was trying to say, and it was from firefighters, it's from civilians, mostly private, just because they're trying to avoid that riffraff, which I totally get
Yeah.
it. Like, to be in a place where you're not trying to say a contentious thing. It's like a news article. It's there. It's not like I'm like making some crazy twist on it, but I'm like, hey, I feel for that. So all to say, no, I'm glad you brought it up, because it brings up this, yeah, what are we doing arguing? And then it became all these conspiracy theories and all this. And I'm like, I'm not trying to argue your truth or anything on here. I'm literally just trying to say it really sucks. And, kind of the inferred is like, when charges get dropped and officers hurt, like, um, I almost got drugged by a car when I was a patrol officer in a canine. And it wasn't even like the charges were dropped, but the detective hit me up. He's kind of like, so I mean, like, I don't think that there's like vehicular assault. He just kind of like told, and I was kind of like, okay. And I didn't feel like I needed anything, but it was just it was kind of just this like hallway conversation. I felt like so kind of discarded and disregarded. And so, I kind of just relayed, like, I can only feel how these officers feel abandoned.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's like a crazy, incendiary type of like comment for me. Like, who's not going to feel that way if they were assaulted? Civilian, officer, store clerk, whatever. And then someone just says, yeah, there's nothing's moving forward. They're pardoned or charged or dropped, however you want to
Yeah.
say it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you're spot on. I mean, we've talked about it throughout this one. They people want to feel valued. And I think when something
Yeah.
bad happens to you and the person that did it isn't held accountable or is dropped, you don't feel valued. I mean, in all aspects of life. So I'm glad you said it. And then you could take the heat and then deal with people just wanting to argue just for the sake of arguing, which is exactly what we're talking about here. Like no
Yep.
one really wins in an argument. If you lose,
Yep.
you lose. If you win, you lose.
Yep. And the flip, going back to this book and like what we're trying to nudge people to think about, whatever your station in life is, whether you're a first responder, a cop, or not, but like, you have a choice in how you interact with everybody. And if you are an official leader, if you are a boss, a supervisor, like, you got to show people that you value them, and you got to have the conversation, take the time, and put in the work. And that could look like, if you're in command staff and your officer gets injured, like, you need to do what you can within your circle of influence, whether it's the prosecutor's office, whatever, helping people understand, like, this is not something that just gets dropped. Like, this is a big deal. When people don't decide that they want to opt out of safety, the public safety like laws. They want to opt out of criminal law. Like they don't have to stop for the police. They can fight. They can do all these things. Like we see how society went recently, right? Hopefully we're walking that back. And I think people know that I'm not like this, like, yeah, we need to come down hard as we're the police. And it's like, no, people need to follow the law. There's a reason why there's these laws. But as administrators, as public officials, you have a duty to support those that are supporting you by virtue of your position, right? It's like a constituency thing. And ultimately it's like helps the big picture. It's supposed to anyway. So
Yeah.
don't want to go down too many rabbit holes, but
That's all
yeah,
we
it's
do,
like,
I feel like.
yeah, I mean, how to win friends and influence people and like be a good person, be empathetic, try to care and show you care. That's kind of like the instead of cliff notes, the grit notes. Like that's what I would say is the takeaway from this book and the concepts therein.
Yeah, I like that. The grit notes. Like
Grit notes.
that's your new slogan. Anything you summarize, you have to call it grit notes.
Yeah. You like grit notes or gritty notes?
I
Use
like
gritty
grit
a lot.
notes.
Hmm.
Grit notes
Okay.
has a better ring to it. But I agree. I think that's wholeheartedly and be intentional and try. And sometimes I hate to say it, you got to fake it to make it. Sometimes you have to push yourself to do some of these very easy things. We probably touched on like half of this book, and people are like, "Oh my god, I'm so bored of hearing about this book." But if you like reading,
If they really are, they would have shut it off.
yeah, they would have never made it to this point. They would have been gone like 50 minutes ago.
No, they're like, I actually liked the episode because they were talking about how they messed up as young cops, and then they started talking about all this outlandish political stuff. They're just trying to incite all this controversy.
Yeah.
It's clearly not.
If we just had a podcast of the times we messed up, we would need probably a whole hour just on that alone.
Oh man, yeah, I need a bigger subscription to my platforms and whatever.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, what are your biggest takeaways? I guess as a whole, because we did cover a lot of prongs, and we could keep going for sure.
Man, I think I think you hit it the nail on the head. It's to be empathetic, it's to be intentional, it's to try to understand where other people are coming from. And oftentimes to be the best conversationalist or be the best person that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with someone else. Like he has this famous thing where he says in a meeting, like, try to always be the last one to talk. Don't be the boss that comes in and says, here's a problem. Here's how I think we're going to fix it. What do you guys think? Because that immediately shuts everyone down. And so it's just the age old thing, listen twice as much as you speak. And I am very much following the challenge of always trying to be the last one to speak in meetings. But yeah, just be empathetic, be a good person, and care about other people at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it goes back to ego. Like, do you have to say that thing, or someone else might say it, and you should feel good? Like, cool, that was a good idea. I had that idea too. And
Yeah.
then,
Or do you have to share that story about yourself? Like, is whatever you're about to say about yourself and the cool thing you did or the war story or whatever your input, like, is it actually necessary to
is it
share?
relevant?
Is it relevant or do you just want
Hmm.
to talk about yourself?
Yeah, yeah. Me monsters.
Me monsters, man.
You need to make a meme, like no me monster T-shirt.
Please do.
All right. Well, thank you, Trevor. I appreciate it. And for those listening, if you like this deep dive, if you liked these concepts from whether it's books or different ideas, if you like Trevor, if you want to have him back on, let me know. Send me a line.
Yeah, if you don't like me, don't say anything. But if you do, feel free. But yeah, this has been super fun. I love that kind of these outside the norm ones. So hopefully people shoot you some really random things like, hey, what do you guys think about this book? Or give us some kind of challenge, give us some kind of topic and see what we think about it. I think that could be fun. You probably might want to edit that part out, but who knows?
No, it's okay. I mean, I don't have to air everything that people send, but
Yeah.
no, for sure. I mean, part of this idea was, me and Trevor go way back. One of my best friends, and we would have all kinds of conversations like most bestie friends do, to include, middle of the night, like working graves through, man, I know that we're hitting an hour here, but I remember specifically when we were talking about like how tech was advancing, and at some point in our careers, like, wouldn't it be crazy if in the interest of officer safety and technological advances, you'd had drones that would go up to the front door and knock and announce, so a copper didn't have to poke their noggin up there and get blasted through the door, and maybe even on a domestic. And then, you'd have someone, I remember saying like someone would come out and enter the door with a bat and like try to hit the drone, and then we'd like surround and barricade, and then like more drones and more officers. And basically someone piloting the drone from the station, which is, this stuff is happening, but we're on the heel. We're basically there, right? Like real-time crime centers, drone fleets, like with amazing capabilities, kind of Overwatch tactics. Yeah, kind of nuts.
Yeah,
But
man. It's the bearded dragon conversations of two friends.
mhm.
Car to car with our red lights on, just like two bearded dragons in a little aquarium, you know?
Terrarium, yeah. No, and
Terrarium, that's what
to
it is,
to
not
come full
aquarium.
circle on why I brought that up was we'd have all these conversations, and then we continue to just nerd out on different ideas, philosophy, things like that, through the years. So it's that offering of something that could be very relevant to police work, to how you do your job, how you interact with your team, up level your leadership game, all that stuff. So that was kind of the crux of where this all started, and yeah, hope you enjoyed. Oftentimes, there's a lot of candidates that want to take the next step in the organization and promote. However, they find themselves at an impasse with where to start. Or they know where to start, but they know that there are so many different elements that are extremely arduous, challenging, and stressful to prepare for. I've prepared a guide because I want to help everyone, no matter what their confidence level is in public speaking or recognizing the different elements or how to show up your best way and highlight your leadership style. A lot of times those folks know exactly what it takes to be a leader because they do it at the line level. However, they are surpassed by those that simply test better, have the gift of the gab, whether or not they actually can put anything behind it, or they've taken the test so many times that they've slowly edged their way up that list and eventually may be in striking zone for a promotion. So if getting selected for the next rank is of interest to you, I highly recommend you do your homework and you recognize resources. And part of doing that homework and recognizing resources is the guide I've prepared. It hones in on a lot of my lessons learned from being on both sides of the table, testing as a sergeant. And although I got the nod in the first round, when I looked at the notes, there were a lot of things I misunderstood. There were a lot of things where I didn't present my best way. I was just fortunate that my total test score was I was fortunate that my total testing process was successful enough to get me in. And then for commander, doing that internal process and external process, seeing some dramatic differences, coming out on top of both processes. However, learning again, when I looked at the notes, there was so much that I left on the table or so much that I misrepresented myself or I didn't convey what I had intended to the assessor. So with all those lessons learned, breaking down the common test components, and also, arguably more importantly, how you identify, define, and prepare your own leadership philosophy that you can not only take into the test, but you can take into your day-to-day interactions with your team, your peers, your subordinates, and your leaders, right? Because leading up is a critical part of organizational development and culture as well. So for more on the guide, you can find it at bluegritwellness.com. That's the promotional guide at bluegritwellness.com/shop. And whether or not you are looking to promote, we all know those people that should be taking the next test that we keep nudging. And those people need to be empowered. They need to find confidence. And a lot of that can come from you just giving them that nod, giving them that support, that encouragement, and telling them where to find the guide. Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.